Welcome to week 3 of Roman and early Christian history and literature. As you can see, we've got quite a bit of material to cover. I'm hoping that doing this during the daytime will make this blackboard a little bit easier to read. So, as we think about the history of Rome, it's important to remember that in the early days, we're talking about very small Rome that is constantly being impacted by the Etruscans, being impacted by the Latin tribes down in here, being impacted by the Samnites, and even being invaded and occupied by the Gauls, and trying to survive. And it's also important to remember that some of the decisions that they made were very important for the development of culture. In class a few weeks ago, the question came up of, okay, so the Romans were the first to pay an army and have a standing army, but what about the Spartans? And I think there's some important distinctions to be made between the Romans and the Spartans. The Romans paid an army once their population got to a certain point. The Spartans were their army, and so we don't have Spartan art or Spartan literature or anything from the Spartans other than their military prowess and their military conquest, because that was their entire culture. Whereas Rome's armies served to expand Rome and to bring her culture to greater and greater heights until the beginning of her decline. Before we start talking about the heights of the Roman Republic, though, I want to back up a little bit and look at what was going on in the rest of the world as Rome is developing towards eventually the Pax Romana. So let's jump back a little bit to 350 BC, and let's jump over to the east. So Persia, which is modern-day Iraq, had an amazing empire in the south and in the east and the Middle East. And such an empire, in fact, that they invaded Greece. We talked about this last year when we did Greek history, and you have that period of the Greco-Persian Wars. By 350 BC, the Persian Empire is declining. Greece has defeated them. Greece has had its own period of great glory, and particularly Athens, but Athens is starting to decline as well. You've gotten into the period of the Peloponnesian Wars when the Greek city-states are constantly involved in battle with one another. And you have the wonderful opportunist and general Philip of Macedon, who by 350 BC has already started to conquer his own people to make sure that Macedonia is safely in his hands and to start looking at wider conquest. He's allied a couple of times with some of the Greek city-states in an attempt to gain control of them. And over the next couple of decades, he's going to continue that until he dominates Greece and, in fact, much of that Eastern Persian Empire before he is assassinated. So, of course, all of that is not in Italy, but it is why Rome is able to grow the way it's able to grow, because the rest of the world powers are occupied with fighting each other. So here's Rome. They've pretty much at this point convinced the Etruscans that messing with them is a bad idea, and the Etruscans themselves are starting to decline. And they're constantly looking for ways to secure their borders. Now, the Romans have a very interesting way of going about this, and nobody ever figures it out. What they do is they look for quarrels between other countries that they can exploit. And a lot of times what they do is they say, oh, these people, the Samnites, are pushing against us and our allies. We'll reach out beyond them and ally with someone on the other side of them and catch them between. They do it over and over again, and no one can seem to understand that, if Rome makes a treaty with your neighbors, you better watch out because they're probably coming for you. So they ally with this city of Capua, which is still a city in modern-day Italy, and they fight this first Samnite war. It lasts for 2 years. from 343 to 341 BC. And at the end of it, they've pushed the Samnites back somewhat. And they make a treaty, and it lasts for a little while. And in the meantime, they've realized that these Latin tribes around them that are sort of kind of allied with them are really weak allies, and they would be much better as client states. And so they take some time, and one by one, for 2 years, they spend time making sure that their dominance of this region of Latium is very, very strong. Because if you're going out to fight the Samnites, the Gauls, the Etruscans, you do not want to have the Latins on your back, possibly betraying you. So in 338, Rome has expanded to 4,500 square miles and has a population of about 500,000. So think about that for a minute. They started out as a group of shepherds and farmers on the hills of Rome. And all they needed was survival. And they involved themselves as, if they needed an army, it was more of a militia-style army. Oh, the Etruscans are coming, let's get together and fight them off. Now we'll go back to our fields. And that works for a long time. But at a certain point, the army becomes more sophisticated as weaponry increases in sophistication and needs more support. And the armies of the field get bigger, and so you need more support. And in that population of 500,000, you can figure about 50% of them are women and children who aren't at all, really very helpful when it comes to an army. So they have to change their methodology if they're going to continue to make conquests. Now, up until the Romans invented the legion, the way that armies fought was that you collected all of the fighting men in your nation, and you gave them weapons, and you put them on the field, and the other enemy did the same thing, and they fought in sort of mass bunches, and whoever had the biggest mass bunch generally won. There's some generalship involved, but there's not a whole lot of generalship involved. And it really comes down to who can put the most men on the field faster. And that's why some of the times in the Greco-Persian War, when Athens defeats the Persians, it's so astonishing because it's a smaller army. How did that happen? Or when the 300 Spartans hold off the Persian army for 3 days under Leonidas, they took advantage of the geography, but also, generally speaking, up until the development of the disciplined legion, whoever had the bigger army won. Well, Camillus realizes, he's a Roman consul and general, and he realizes that he can do better than that. So what he does is he organizes a legion. So legion just means to collect, and it was what they called the army from early on because they collected all the fighting men and they put them into groups. So what he does is he says, okay, I am going to have a legion, and it's always going to have the same number of men, and the number of men are going to be divided up into certain kinds of jobs. So I'm going to have in my legion 3,000 heavily armed soldiers who've been trained to use their weapons. I'm going to have 1,000 lightly armed soldiers who I can use as scouts, who I can move very quickly, who can march very quickly. And then, because I know sometimes I'm really going to need some super speed, I'm going to have 300 horsemen. Now, they weren't very effective as fighters. The Roman army was always primarily an infantry army. And part of that is that stirrups haven't been invented yet. And if you've ever ridden a horse and tried to swing a weapon, it's a whole lot harder if you don't have something to brace your feet against. But they were great for scouts. They were great for running down the enemy's infantry. There were some ways in which they were very, very useful. And later on, when Rome moves in and conquers Persia, they'll actually add Persian archers to their horsemen with some of the legions, and that made them really kind of fearsome. And I have to say that shooting accurately while riding a horse with no stirrups is quite a feat. They divided their men into maniples, and a maniple has 120 men in it. So you can do the math, figure out how many were in the legion. And then when they went on the battlefield, they arranged them like a checkerboard. So here's your first row, and here's your second row, like this. So 120, 120, 120, 120, 120, 120, like this. These guys have javelins that they can throw, and they have swords. And what they would do is that the first row would advance, throw their javelins, attack the first row of the enemy, and then the second row would advance through them. Well, these guys retired, throw their javelins, attack the enemy, and they would keep rotating back and forth like that. Well, of course, every time that second row advanced, you were making ground. It's a grind. And the Romans figured out very quickly that this enabled them to put a smaller, more disciplined force on the field and defeat larger forces. And they trained their men to work together as a unit as opposed to individual fighters. And especially when they fought the Gauls in Cisalpine Gaul and later in what's now France and even in Britain when they fought the Celts. That was extremely important because a disciplined force will overcome an individual berserker pretty much all the time, with very few exceptions. So they are constantly improving this, but of course if you've got 4,300 men, you also need armorers, you also need people to feed the horses, you also need quartermasters, you also need all kinds of logistics and supply. And in addition, you have the rest of the population is there, and they are growing the crops, doing the trade, providing the goods, all of the things that go toward equipping the army and also building the glory of Rome. Because remember, to the Roman, the most important thing after the glory of his family is the glory of Rome, and those two are inextricably intertwined with each other. So another important change that comes around in this period of the 3rd and 4th centuries BC is that they change the basis for citizenship. You will have read in your book about Appius Claudius Caecus. He became censor in 312. And one of the things that he realized was that with trade goods going through Rome, with conquests being made and goods being brought back as spoil, that there was what we would today call, it was a middle class of merchants and traders who didn't own land. In fact, they might even rent their shop. And that those people contributed to Rome in such a way, to Rome's economy, that they also needed to have citizenship. So citizenship in about 312 stops being tied to land ownership. Although there's always still a sort of cachet to owning land. But there's this middle class that rises up, and it's that middle class that will become very important in later politics. So there's the beginning of a middle class in about 312. There's the recognition that there's a middle class. And Caecus is also a writer and a speaker, and he's the first Roman that we know of who wrote down his speeches so other people could read them. Appius Claudius Caecus, which I cannot remember how to spell. Caecus means the blind because he lost his sight. He's called the father of Roman prose because he wrote down speeches and not just poetry. And we'll look at some of his speeches this coming week. He's also very important because he built the first Roman road, the Appian Way, because eventually it went from Rome all the way down to Tarentum down here. But basically they had another war with the Samnites, and they needed a way to move supplies. And so he built a road. And by 295 BC, that road was a paved road. And it started this business of the Romans building roads. They all started in Rome, and they built roads all over Europe. And they built roads down into the Middle East. And those roads were the primary means of transportation in inland areas where you couldn't use the sea. Really, until the 19th century with the railroad, the Roman roads were the means of getting around in medieval and Renaissance and Enlightenment Europe. We still aren't quite sure what they did to make roads that survived that long, because we can't do it with modern asphalt. It was 132 miles long originally, and then it was longer after that. As I said, it went all the way to Tarentum. So Philip of Macedon by 338 BC, remember we're counting down because we're in BC, not AD, he has completely dominated Greece. And the Romans get a little bit concerned that he may start looking elsewhere. And in addition, there is his nephew, Alexander of Epirus, who's sitting here in Syracuse wondering, oh dear, is uncle going to come take Sicily? And so the Romans conclude a treaty with Cisalpine Gaul so that they basically can pay attention to southern Italy and Greece, and not have to think about Gaul for a little bit anyway. It doesn't last very long. That there was always conflict between Gaul and Rome. But fortunately for them, in 336, Philip is assassinated. And Alexander, his son, Alexander the Great, is far more interested in conquering Persia than he is in conquering Italy, which really isn't a power yet and is full of these quarreling tribes that would be a real pain in the neck to subdue. So he just kind of leaves it alone. And then in 332, the people of Tarentum look at how the Romans have been subduing Latium, how the Romans have been slowly pushing the Samnites back, and say, you know what, we need an ally. And so for an ally, they ask Alexander of Epirus to be their ally. And that is the seed, if you will, of Rome's conflict with Carthage, which we will talk about next week. We'll start talking about the Punic Wars. Excuse me. In the meantime, Rome is subduing the rest of Italy. The Etruscans at one point decided that they were going to help the Samnites. The Romans were like, yeah, no, sorry. So they start fighting in this direction. They conclude a treaty here, and they turn around to this direction. They conclude a treaty here, they turn around to this direction. And eventually, hold on, I've got the date written down here. By 281, Rome holds all of Italy from Cisalpine Gaul south. It's 15,000 square miles. The population obviously is much larger. And they need to spend some time consolidating what they have, making sure that Roman law runs everywhere that they want Roman law to run, that the client states are doing what they're supposed to do, and so on. And so they settle into a short period of consolidation. I'm just going to put some other, or really just that one, I think, date on the board. They settle into a short period of consolidation because while they've been busy subduing Italy, Carthage has been busy trying to wrest the rest of Sicily from the Greeks. So Alexander the Great died. He divided his empire between his generals. The Ptolemies are down here in Egypt. Carthage is over here, and the Carthaginians hold about half of Sicily. The Greeks hold the rest because Syracuse here at the end of Sicily was a Greek trade colony. The Carthaginians are looking at the Ptolemies going, yeah, well, we can't really expand that way. And we really expanded as far into Africa as we can. And so look at this rich trade route here. We would really like to hold that. And they've gone up into Spain as well. You know, they have northern Africa, and the Straits of Gibraltar are very narrow. So they've taken Spain and allied themselves with tribes in Spain. And in the meantime, Rome is looking at these Greek client states going, yeah, we like having them as a buffer. So they ally with Syracuse, and because they're allied with Syracuse, they're going to come into direct conflict with Carthage. But they have consolidated their hold on Italy to the point where the Carthaginians think, oh, well, we'll invade Italy, and all of those people that the Romans have defeated will join us. And they are so wrong. So let's talk a little bit about the law that the Romans imposed. Now, it's important to remember that the law that the Romans imposed for citizens was a little different than what they imposed what the rights of conquered peoples were. But again, at this point, you can buy your citizenship, and citizenship has been extended to the middle class. So this law applies to most people under Roman rule. Important things about it. One, it was actually a code. It was written down. There were law books. There were lawyers. And so people could say, well, the law says such and such, and they could look at and agree, yeah, the law says, it actually says such and such. So it's very just and maybe not by our standards, but it was very clear, which was a big difference to a lot of the tribes and cities that they had conquered, especially when they start getting into what's now France and down into these tribal areas down here, where the rule of the king and what the king said, and you could appeal to tradition, but etc. So what were some of the laws? These are from the 12 tables. If a plaintiff summons a defendant to court, he has to go. If he doesn't go, the plaintiff shall call a witness that he summoned him to go, and then he can haul the defendant into court by force. When a debt has been acknowledged or a judgment about a matter has been pronounced in court, 30 days is the given time of grace. After that, the arrest of a debtor may be made by laying on of hands. Bring him into court. If he does not satisfy the judgment, or no one in court offers himself as surety on his behalf, the creditor may take the defaulter with him. He may bind him in stocks or fetters. He may bind him with weight not less of 15 pounds, or with more if he shall so desire. The debtor, if he shall wish, may live on his own. If he does not live on his own, the person who holds him in bonds shall give him 1 pound of grits each day. He may give more if he shows so desire. There was a right of compromising, and unless they made a compromise, debtors were held in bond for 60 days. During that time, they were brought before the court in the meeting place on 3 successive market days, and the amount for which they were judged liable was announced. On the 3rd market day, they suffered capital punishment. They were executed, or were delivered up for sale abroad across the Tiber. And so this is interesting. Of course, this is the 12 tables, which were originally written down in the 450s. Later that would be revised. So abroad might mean, anywhere in the Roman Empire and not just across the Tiber. Persons shall mend the roadway. If they keep it not laid with stones, the holder can drive the beast where he wish. Should a tree on a neighbor's farm be bent crooked by the wind and lean over your farm, you may, by the law of 12 tables, take legal action for the removal of that tree. That actually is law that we still have. A provision of the law of the 12 tables was made that a man could gather up fruit that was falling down onto another man's farm. So it is ordained, here's one more I want to give, here we go. It is ordained any person who destroys by burning any building or heap of corn deposited alongside a house should be bound, scourged, and put to death by burning at the stake, provided that he committed the said misdeed with malice aforethought. But if he committed it by accident, by negligence, it is ordained he repair the damage, or if he be too poor to be competent for such punishment, he shall receive a lighter chastisement. So a very careful protection of the foodstuffs of the empire as well. So I want to say a couple of things very quickly about what you should be thinking about with your choice of a subject for the term paper, excuse me, the midterm paper. So your midterm paper should be approximately 5 pages. And it's not a, excuse me, it is not a tell what happened. You're going to do analysis. So for instance, you might have a term paper on how the Roman legion was effective at fighting and occupying. And you might look at supply, you might look at organization, you might look at how quickly they were able to move people or soldiers from one area to another. Another concept might be citizenship. How a middle class, merchant class changed Roman culture. So these are not intended to be, so and so the general went here and did this and went here and did that. Those are that's factual information that needs to be fodder for an analytical paper. So please pick a topic so that we can discuss topics and possible theses in Monday's class. Thank you very much and have a good week.